into the second last session immediately. We have Seasons of Flight. The theme is Women Uninterrupted, and it's a part of the Real Women series presented by Dove. We'll have Farah Ghuznavi, Manjushree Thapa, and they'll be introduced by Ritu Menon. So without further ado, I pass it on to Ritu to begin.
Thank you. Sometimes these label mics are a bit erratic, so if you can't hear, please tell us. Can't hear? Not even there? Can someone fix the mics? So embarrassing to be disentangled like that on stage. Anyway, welcome everyone, and it's lovely to be here in this really beautiful hall, which becomes more and more informal as the evening goes on, even though it's a darbar. And I hope that we will have an equally informal and scintillating discussion and reading this evening. I'm Ritu Menon. I'm a feminist publisher and writer from India, and we publish a great deal of fiction, non-fiction, and so on. And I'm delighted to be here to speak to, on my immediate right, Farah Ghuznavi, a very talented young writer from Bangladesh, and to her right, Manjushree Thapa from Nepal and Canada. Am I right? Maybe Seasons of Flight has something to do with where all of us are located. Of course, I mean, in a very obvious way, this is a sort of mini South Asia trio, but that conversation I leave for later, for when we begin to do the readings and the talking. For now, I will only say that, and I think that both writers, Farah as well as Manjushree, will incorporate their little sort of biographical details as they speak. But for the moment, I just want to point to a few things which I think might get our discussion going. Both Manjushree and Farah have in common, of course, the fact that they are very talented and very widely published and regarded writers. Both have in common a very direct involvement with grassroots activities and programs in their own countries. Nepal and Bangladesh have had, continue to have, and a very deep engagement with politics in all its aspects. So not parliamentary politics, not party politics, of which we in India have altogether too much, but politics in all its dimensions. Both write fiction and non-fiction. Farah is a columnist with the Daily Star, which is an English daily in Bangladesh. Manjushree writes non-fiction in long form. Both also write short stories, which will be the subject of today's evening, our conversation this evening. Both also translate. So the multiplicity of genres in which they work is, to me, very interesting and also very unusual. It's not common to find young writers, younger writers, or any writers for that matter, who actually straddle these different forms. But today, I think what we are going to do, or what we thought we might do, is to speak a little bit about the short story, which is a genre which has in a strange way and in a curiously inexplicable way, been discounted among, let's say, in the literary environment. And it has been discounted in favor of the novel. In other words, the short form in favor of the longer form. There are several myths around this. The preference by publishers, on the part of publishers, or on the part of media, on the part of reviewers, or prize givers and award givers, that a novel is somehow a more worthwhile form. But in actual fact, the reality is that some of the finest literary writing is the short story. Some of the finest literary publishers cherish their short story lists. And some of the longest lasting literary work, by which I mean a long shelf life, has been the short story. And of course, we all know and have our favorite short story writers, but I will just say that the Nobel to Alice Munro this year was a recognition of the short story form as, in my view, one of the most, as a publisher, one of the most difficult genres to write, to be skilled in. I also want to say that as a publisher, and maybe we can take this up later in discussion or when we open it to the floor, that in my experience at any rate, as a publisher, I've seldom noticed a huge difference between the sales of novels and short story anthologies. They could be single author anthologies, they could be multi-author anthologies, but I actually don't see that there is such a difference in their commercial performance as we are led to believe. So I'm not going to be dwelling on that too much now. I hope that we come upon this as we go along. But what I would like to do is, the format will be as follows, that we will begin with a short conversation among us, among the three of us, which will be followed by readings by Manjushree and Farah, and then we will go back to a conversation which will be between them, between us, between them and you, and we will allow it to flow. And I'm quite confident that it will flow in a most interesting and illuminating way. One of the things that I wanted to start with is to pose to both of you a question, which is that people often say that the short story is a form that is chosen by people who are short of time, and that it's a form more often chosen by women writers because they don't actually find the time it takes to write a novel. So is that something that you would agree with?
I think it was Mark Twain who said something along the lines of, he was planning to write a short letter, but he didn't have the time. And I think, at least in my limited experience in writing short stories, I think the amount of effort that you have to put in to really trim the fat off and, you know, the excess of words and not allow yourself to go off into these various, passages. I would say that it does take quite a long time to write a good short story. And so I'm not sure that's really...
As long as a novel?
No, definitely not as long as a novel, but I mean those are in absolute terms in that sense. I'm saying in relative terms, the amount of time you would probably need to invest, everyone is not like me. I did 20 revisions of a short story after, it was published 3 times, and in each iteration I did another 3 revisions afterwards. And the latest version that's in Fragments of River Song, the book that I recently launched, is probably the 20th revision. So perhaps it's just me, but I think it does take a fair bit of time.
But my feeling about this is also, it's not just that women tend to
Can she be heard?
write. It's not just that women tend to write short form more, it's also in terms of vernacular language. So in Nepal, for example, we have most of our literature is being produced in Nepali or in other languages. In newspapers, there'll be a little supplement or there'll be some space, there'll be literary magazines. So actually, I think there's something of the truth to say that it's the form of a more pressed, more marginal, community. So I do think that it's a form that lends itself to giving voice to those who don't have the leisure, because it does, and I say this as someone who's in my 4th year of writing a novel that just won't finish. Those who don't have that leisure, I think it really gives voice to. It's a good form for that.
Well, of course, there's also the fact that if you want to be published very quickly, then a short story is more likely to be published in a magazine, in a periodical, in a literary journal, or even in an anthology than a long work. So, of course, historically, that's where women have been published. They have been published initially in periodicals. And so I suppose in that sense, it's a very practical choice.
The bias against the short story to me seems to really come from publishers. and I'm sorry, I know you're a publisher. But it really comes particularly from Western publishers, I think, who, and maybe it's been tested out in the market there, that it doesn't sell as well as novels, but somehow it seems like a testing ground to see whether you turn into a novelist. Yes. And I think that's completely inaccurate. I think readers in our part of the world are really comfortable reading short stories, and that's what readers also have time for.
I think, yeah, picking up on that, I think definitely in our part of the world, the short story is more respectable, I think, particularly among readers, possibly also among publishers. You're one of the first I've actually heard speak out for short story collections, and I'm very grateful for that. But I think even in the Western world, I think increasingly in the modern world, wherever you are, I suspect there is going to be a niche for the right kind of marketing for a short story, because it is something that you can read within a limited period of time and get something in its entirety. I have a lot of friends, in fact, who say, you know, started this novel, I've been reading it for the last 3 months because I read 2 pages a night or whatever it is. And I think in that sense, there's something there which perhaps is not being properly looked at or exploited in marketing terms, if publishers are that worried about it, to say that, you know. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's a little bit of a question for me always, because if you think of the popularity of blogs, for example, now what is a blog? A blog is a very short, very occasional piece, and yet it seems somehow to have captured the imagination. And a lot of younger people, I'm told, read and write blogs with the kind of facility and the kind of ease and spontaneity that now means that there are anthologies of blogs. That what sometimes is presented as a novel is actually just a series of connected blogs. And so in that sense, it doesn't seem to have the same kind of reception from publishers, by publishers, as perhaps the short story does. But Manju, I wanted to ask you specifically, since you write both short stories and novels, what is it, and some of your short stories are just a page long, what are called flash stories. So what is it that makes you decide the form, one over the other?
I think that there's one very big consideration when I decide to write a novel about, you know, a certain subject, is can I live with it for 4 or 5 years? Is this something that's going to sustain my interest for that long, and can I grow into it? So that's very important. But I also feel like every story demands its own form. So there are some things that won't sustain, you know, a long telling. There's, you know, the flash fictions that I write are really just observations and kind of photographs of little moments, whereas the longer short stories that I write, you know, they have plots, events unfold, and a novel is something that, you know, you just, I think it demands it. It's something that much weightier, it's what's the term I'm looking for? It's got many different strands running through it, so it's not a simple and spontaneous piece as a short story can be. I think that you have many different arguments running through a novel, and so.
So do you find yourself interrupting your novel writing with a short story or two?
It's a great relief when I can. The last novel I wrote, which was called Seasons of Flight, I interrupted that novel, wrote a non-fiction book, and then got back.
But a long non-fiction book.
Yes. And then got back to the novel and finished that. So a novel is just, it's got that leisurely
But
time.
when you say that it has to be something you can live with, do you mean the subject or the characters?
Both of them. The characters certainly in the way I write, I plot it all out. I know what's going to happen. I know what I want, and then of course everything changes. So the characters change and grow and take the story elsewhere. So they have to be characters I'm interested in. The subject mainly has to be something that I want to learn about, I want to investigate, and I'm interested in to stick with for 4 or 5 years. Yeah, mainly the subject.
And is it a clear and deliberate choice for you, Farah? Because you haven't yet written a novel, or even, let's say, a very long short story. So is it the form of choice for you?
I think in my case, it's slightly embarrassing to admit this, but I think it's a form of cowardice in my case, because I spent a long time believing that I couldn't write fiction and convincing myself that I couldn't. And when there was a particular incident which came up in Bangladesh when I encountered this newspaper headline, which upset me very much, about a child domestic worker who was killed by her employer. And my sense of outrage, probably partly as an activist, got me past the idea that I couldn't write this story, so I did write it. And that made me realize I could write fiction. And I think
was it fiction?
Yes, I mean it was fiction insofar as the three things I knew about her: I knew her name was Rupali, I knew she was 10 years old, and I knew that she was beaten to death in the final instance. There had been a long history of abuse with a rolling pin. That's all I knew about her. And the story is basically a story, it's called A Small Sacrifice, and it's a story told about this young child who's sent from the village by relatively well-meaning parents to the city to work, and that is completely fiction. I have no idea what Rupali's story was, where she came from, but those three elements, those two elements rather, her age and her name, her manner of death, remain the same. So that made me realize that I could actually write, I think. And after that, the stories just came almost, as Manju was saying, they came in a topic form, and then they decided. I've written several pieces of flash fiction. I mean, half of the pieces in Fragments of River Song are flash fiction of, slightly longer flash or short, and the other 6 are short stories. And I think in all of those, it was the characters and the topic that decided the length of the story. Having said that, I will say I do actually have 3 short stories which are very long indeed. They're around 12 to 15,000 words, but they haven't been published in anything I've put out yet. So, and someone whom I highly respect recently informed me that she felt that my style was actually long form, so I'm beginning to feel more optimistic about the possibility of a novel sometime.
So a newspaper headline was the trigger for your fiction, but what brought you to writing, Manju? I mean, the reason I'm posing this to both of them is that they have such an active background in grassroots development work, as well as in working on issues on the ground. And almost all the writing of both of you that I have read, in one way or another, refers back to it, either through the fiction or the non-fiction, or even the flash fiction. So what really was it that brought you to writing?
I think for me, it was a process of discovering Nepal. I grew up in the States and went back to Nepal after college, and found myself in a country that was changing so rapidly that I almost couldn't keep up with it. Since then we've had a democratic revolution, we've had a Maoist revolution, we've had the king's takeover, we've had a second democratic revolution, we're trying to come up with a new constitution. The country is in constant churn, and so I really became interested in the way we all live in the middle of this immense churn, almost a revolutionary period in our country. And just, our lives are so fleeting, and they're just in this very watery area where nothing is stable. So that is really...
But wouldn't that have been more suitable for non-fiction?
Well, I actually
You
began
did that
with
too.
non-fiction. I began writing with non-fiction. I wrote a book, a travel log first to the area of Mustang, which is on the Tibet border. And
What the name of the book is?
Mustang Boat in Fragments. And then after that, I became interested in fiction because I was interested in more interiority than non-fiction allowed. And then started to write fiction from then, and it's been, a novel set in an election, or one of our election campaigns that we used to have in the 1990s. And then other fiction and non-fiction, always about the changes that are going on in Nepal.
And your subject matter is always based in Nepal.
It has been always based in Nepal. I also write about the Nepali diaspora because that's something I'm interested in. For me, the work I did very early on in my life in NGOs gave me this span from the village to the international, which is where I grew up. And so that tends to be something I'm really interested in almost all of my books. I tried to pull together the village and the globe because I think we are now so interconnected that Nepali village life is so deeply affected by what's happening in the rest of the world.
So maybe we can do a little bit of reading now. So Farah, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. I'll just start by warning all of you that various pieces that I've written tend to be very different from each other. So I would not like this to necessarily be representative, depending on whether or not you like it, I might add. Okay. So the piece is called Waiting for the Storm. It's happening again. A familiar rage unfolds its sticky wings within the captive interior of my chest, a monstrous butterfly emerging gracelessly from its cocoon. It's the same every night. The taste of panic blooms bitter on my tongue. Swallowing hard, I wonder how much longer I can bear this charade. I sculpt my features into submissiveness by a sheer act of will, reminding myself sternly that it's only during dinner that I must endure your company. It's the one meal that we eat together. Indeed, the only time of day that we are even in the same room. I have tapped unexpected creativity to find excuses for wandering away after you return home from work. I disappear to the far ends of the house, carefully casual in my movements so as not to attract unwanted attention. You haven't noticed my reaction now either. You never do. Spooning your food onto that ridiculous brass platter that you insist on using, you proceed to eat it in the familiar, methodical, maddening sequence that supposedly provides optimal nutrition. You're obsessed with your health. Now in your 50s, you want to live forever. Ayurveda has provided the answer as far as you're concerned, returning to the ways of our ancestors, you call it. The frugality of the system suits you, an approach both pure and puritanical. You can spare me the lectures, I know all about it. How many times have you droned on, haranguing me about the spices to grind, which fresh herbs to use for a particular dish, and so on and so endlessly on. Thanks to you, I've spent years learning about the medicinal benefits of plants, but time spent gathering knowledge is never wasted. My attention returns unexpectedly to the present, as you actually tell me that something tastes good, but it's too little, too late. I'm tired of it all now, of your endless complaints, your chronic self-absorption. My impatience to get away begins to spiral out of control. Your words are gradually crowded out by the kalbushaki taking over my brain. Soon I will hear nothing but the relentless raindrops beating a wild tattoo against my shuttered skull. I clench my teeth from the effort of keeping the whirlwind of rage at bay. Unaware of my traitorous thoughts, your lips continue to move. They flap in the quickening breeze while that insidious inner voice of mine mocks every move that you make. Your preoccupation with your irregular bowels, your mother's opinions on everything, your brother's financial success that you profess to admire but resent so deeply. When I married you, I was the awkward daughter in my accomplished family, not academically inclined despite my professorial parentage, nor light-skinned and graceful as we are bludgeoned into believing that a Desi woman should be. More than 2 decades older, turmeric stained by the remnants of a failed marriage, you were nevertheless deemed a catch for a girl like me. With neither beauty nor intellect to recommend me, my parents were happy at what they considered a fair exchange. A youthful bride who would restore your status as a real man in return for my guaranteed salvation from the disgrace of potential spinsterhood. In the beginning, I was too inexperienced to know what to expect. I had merely hoped to escape the weight of doomed parental expectations, to begin living a life of my own, however ordinary. Whatever references I had were drawn from the starry-eyed heroines of the Mills and Boon romances that I was so addicted to. But 10 dreary years, the despair of continuous boredom and 3 miscarriages later, I have come to realize that this is no Cinderella story. You are hardly a savior, not even much of a man, really. I wish I could have just left you, but my parents would never have provided shelter to such a disgraceful daughter. And I had little faith in my own skills. A knowledge of the more arcane aspects of botany doesn't count for much in the modern-day job market. No, initiating the departure from my marriage would have been excruciating, involving a series of post-mortems and recriminations, warnings and wishful thinking about second chances. So I found another way. You will be the one to leave, though not just yet. You will die. Datura and aconite are well-known herbal toxins, but there are many other, more obscure witches' weeds tucked away in the depths of the manuals, awaiting discovery by a discerning scholar. In the end, I found the perfect one. In tiny doses, mitrachorum is undetectable and highly effective. There are no visible side effects until the final moments. I can vouch for the truth of those claims. Since I started, you haven't displayed so much as a diminishing of appetite for this pure veg pap that you insist on inflicting on us both, let alone signs of poisoning. To assuage my fraying patience, all I have to do is dwell on the years of freedom ahead. I am no longer bothered by the pangs of conscience. They suffocated long ago under the obese weight of your demands. And the benefits of being a too young bride are now becoming increasingly evident to me. They are further enhanced by your miserly habits, which have guaranteed me a solvent future as your grieving widow. And when that time comes, I will finally be free of those who have for so long, in the name of respectability, controlled my life. All I need is a little more patience. The storm will break soon, but I am ready, waiting in my bunker, yearning for its arrival.
Well, Farah, I must say that when I finished that story, I said 3 cheers, but I did wonder why you call it. By the way, it's from her recently published anthology called Fragments of River Song. What a lovely title. But I did wonder why you called it Waiting for the Storm and not Deliverance.
I wrote this. This is one of those stories that I wrote according to a prompt. There was a call for submissions in the US for an anthology called, I think it was called Waiting for the Storm. So they wanted that metaphor. Oh no, sorry, it was called The Storm is Coming. And then the idea was, well, when is the storm coming when you've been waiting for a very long time? So that's how the title came about.
But she's actually making the storm.
Yes.
Rather than just
ensuring
waiting
that it arrives,
for it.
yes,
She's making sure it'll arrive.
Summoning the storm, perhaps?
I don't know. I mean, I was just struck by the fact that here's this woman who's actually finally writing her destiny. And that destiny is something so deliberated and so confident that she isn't waiting for anything. She's actually just going ahead and doing it. You said that there was a lot of diversity in the stories, but is there a sort of thread, a running thread, of what seems to me to a casual reader, an undercurrent of quite somber, rather sad sometimes lives? Is that accidental?
I think it is, and I think it's perhaps not. That's why I was talking about, the problems of finding things that are representative. When you were asking Manju what brought her into writing, two things brought me into it. One was that I really got tired of struggling with these voices in my head that never went away until they were on paper. So partly it was a kind of therapeutic and a survival response to just get rid of them. The second part of that was I have a background in development work, and I've spent much of the last 15, 20 various years. Organizations, Grameen Bank or the UN and various NGOs both in Bangladesh and outside. And I met some amazing people and I heard some amazing stories. And one of the things about Bangladesh is I think generally in the international media but also in the regional media, you get very bogged down in stereotypes about the country, and some of them are very outdated, and it got exhausting to continually read these same stories of either sort of famine, despair, disaster and poverty, which are all part of the truth but hardly the entire truth, or the 2.5 very optimistic stories about NGOs or Grameen or whatever. And I was just thinking that it would be nice to have something out there which is a bit more representative of the nuances of, you were talking about the title. The idea of the fragments came because I was thinking of Bangladesh, contemporary Bangladesh in a way, as being a sort of, it's still an emerging mosaic. We don't quite know, there are very many different forces at play and we don't quite know what the final picture will look like. But I was trying to think of these little stories as fragments within that larger mosaic. And that's, so I'm not sure that I would agree with you that they are all sad, because I think if you look at a story like Getting There, I think that's very much of it. It's a character who leaves a difficult childhood and her home and makes a new life for herself, and then for a family crisis has to return there, discovers that things are not quite as she thought when she was there. And for me that story is a little bit about redemption and also about rediscovering or exploring new aspects of things that you thought you knew very well. Similarly, the Mosquito Net Confessions, I think, is, at least it was intended to be a funny story, about two city girls who go off on a field trip and have to negotiate a very different cultural terrain, and some of it is amusing and disastrous, and some of it is part of a learning experience, so that you come out of that experience very different than you went in. So I think, yes, some of the topics invariably, perhaps as activists or as development workers, some of the topics that you come across will be somber, but I would like to believe that the treatment of all of them is not. I mean, you have to laugh in order to survive some of this.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Well, that was also a very cheerful story.
The one you just watched. It was an extremely cheerful story. Oh, Manju, would you like to?
Okay. I'm going to read from my collection of...
from the anthology is called Tilled Earth.
It's a collection, it has some longer stories and some shorter stories. I'm going to read some very, very brief stories. Really just meant to be snapshots of life. This one is called Solitaire. Hit Bahadur Kharka had discovered Solitaire on the computer, and he was spending his last days at the Ministry of Home Affairs shuffling the deck whenever the hand seemed unfavorable. Late in life, perhaps. Years he had worked as a clerk, writing each visitor's name on a slip, taking it in to the latest minister. Someone is hoping to meet His Excellency, and returning to his office with its tatty jute carpet and paint peeling off the walls, its lumpy sofa and stained curtains, its sole rickety desk now boasting a brand new Korean computer. Democracy had come and gone and come again over the span of his career. Movements had started, a war had been fought, scores of ministers had passed through his life. 19.5 years he had waited for visitors. He had a mere 6 months left till retirement. He was learning to play solitaire on the computer, late in life, perhaps. And then the second story I want to read is it's about a woman, and I actually still struggle with this, I think because I have a very androgynous life in Nepal, in a society.
You have an androgynous
I have a lot of mobility. I have the mobilities and freedoms of a man, or even more freedom than most Nepali men do. And so I have a very androgynous life experience, and so I sometimes find it very hard to write about women who live in a very prescribed sort of gender role in Nepal. So I always struggle a bit with my women characters. This one is called 19 Years His Junior. First, Urmila pruned the lemon bush on the balcony, cutting off all its crisp dead leaves with a pair of old scissors gone to rust. Then she untangled the jasmine vine from the iron grills that they had grown onto and propped up the stems, making sure they covered the water spots along the wall. Next, she plucked the dry leaves off the jade plants that lined the balcony railing. What else needed doing in this flat free of parents-in-law and family members? She was a liberated woman. She used to be active in district politics. Now here she was in Kathmandu. The sky was darkening rapidly. She had to squint to see. She started to snap off the dead shoots of the bamboo plant, but she could not tell apart the dead from the live shoots, so she took up a broom and began to sweep the balcony floor. When she tasted dust in her mouth, she realized all she was doing was raising a dust storm. So she put down the broom and fetched a bucket full of water from inside. She sprinkled liberal handfuls of water into the indigo night. Then she felt about for the rusty scissors, crouching in the dark till she found them on the floor. By the time she found them, it was 9 and she was tired and no longer agitated. That dinner had long since cooled again tonight, exactly a year after her marriage, to the party's central committee member, 19 years her senior. I'll read a very tiny one called The Hungry Statistician. The 5 most widely farmed grains of the nation are paddy, maize, wheat, barley, millet. Paddy, maize, wheat, barley, millet. Paddy, maize, wheat, barley, millet. Paddy, maize, wheat, barley, paddy, maize, wheat, barley, millet. As soon as I finish this report, I'll go eat some paddy, maize, wheat, barley, millet.
That was nice and nourishing. Okay, here's a question for both of you, or rather here's something for all of us to think about. You know, it seems to me that everyone is sort of quite international, within quotes, these days, in terms of travel and exposure. I mean, look at this place. I mean, look at an event like this, for example. We don't really, I mean, we're all reasonably cosmopolitan and we feel reasonably at home in most places. But writers are still categorized by country, almost always, especially in the South. It's a Latin American writer, an African writer, South Asian writer, then an Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, whatever. Of course, I think in the West, too, they are characterized by country, but there it's more a question of language. So if you're French, it refers to your language. It doesn't necessarily refer to a cultural space. Whereas I think that for many of us, country is synonymous with culture. And either implicitly or explicitly, you sort of write to a particular association or expectation. You live in Canada and in Kathmandu, in Nepal, and Farah, you live principally in Bangladesh. But you spoke specifically about stereotypes. So the question is, does this matter in your writing? I mean, specifically for both of you. I don't mean it as a general philosophical existential question, but specifically for both of you.
Do the stereotypes matter?
No,
or
does
the
location
matter?
Location and the implicit expectation from that location. Does it matter? Because as I say, we're all quite international in so many ways.
I don't think it matters in the sense that I sit there consciously thinking, here I am, a Bangladeshi writer writing about Bangladesh. No.
Does it matter?
It's the characters who speak to me, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I've written 1 or 2 stories which are set overseas, Firstly, I think, diaspora literature, there's so much anyway, and those are people who are living it and writing it and so on. So essentially, I don't think that I consciously think of it like that, no. I think of it in terms of an idea that comes for a story, and then that character or that set of characters will be living with me for a little while, and then perhaps, a week later I'll actually start writing that story. When I'm writing it, I'm not thinking about the fact that it's set in rural Bangladesh or urban Bangladesh or, not Bangladesh but a Bangladeshi character elsewhere. I think I'm drawing on Bangladesh essentially because that is perhaps what's most important to me. It's what I know and it's what I want to write about, but I do think that it's...
Manju, you said you linked the village and the global and the,
I mean, I find that interesting. For me, it really matters. For me, it's very, very much about Nepal and about the Nepali condition and the Nepali state and, being Nepali, and so that is my obsession. Where my argument with the publishing industry is what within that we're allowed to publish or encouraged to publish or rewarded for publishing and punished for publishing. So I think that there's a very, very narrow space given, especially, there's a real difference between Indian writers and Nepali writers, for example, because Nepal is not a master country, it's not
But Indian writers writing in English.
In English. So this is a country that has absolutely no geopolitical, strategic, any importance at all. And so we are given a very narrow space to write about the really sensational aspects of the country. And that was something I was never interested in, or the cliches, the stereotypes, the mountains, the hill sort of spirit. And that is something I'm completely uninterested in writing about. And so that is, for me, being placed as a Nepali writer is not so much the issue as what then I get to do within that space.
And I think picking up on that, one of the things that does bother me a lot, and I do try to reflect it in my writing, is this issue of authenticity. I was recently in a workshop where somebody said, writers make their own authenticity. If you don't feel like being authentic, writers make their own authenticity. If you don't feel like being authentic, you don't have to be. I don't actually agree with that, because I do feel that it's not that everything I write about or that Manju writes about has necessarily happened or whatever, but it's more that it could have. These things could have happened to these characters, and I think that is quite important, because there was this wonderful talk by Chimamanda Adichie where she discusses the single narrative. When you come from a developing country, I think that's a real problem. India has a little bit more leeway because it's such a huge country and there are so many cultures and perceptions, but there's still a sense that, if you write from Bangladesh or you write from Nepal, there is this idea, I think, from publishers about what will a Western audience be comfortable with. And to be quite honest, I'm not sitting there thinking what will the audience be comfortable with.
Why would a Western audience matter if you're not going to be published in the West?
No, because you don't know whether you are or not. I'm just saying, if you send a story out, okay, I'll just give you an example. I sent a story out which was a story about somebody with mental health problems, a mad woman as they would call her in a village. And the story was accepted by a quite reputable journal. They told me they liked it. They said they wanted some edits to be done. All good, we would discuss it. And it was actually really beneficial for me, the editor I worked with, and the crunch came when they wanted me to include a character who was going to be, they said, what about social services? And I said, you're talking about a Bangladeshi village, and there are barely, government extension services for agriculture. They're certainly not going to be for mental health. And they said, no, but for an American, it was an American journal, for an American reader to relate to this, you have to bring in something about social services. So you should bring in like a character who is the social worker. And I tried to explain that this was just not going to work. There is no character. And in the end, I had to pull the story from that journal very reluctantly, because I couldn't actually create this character who, I know for a fact will not be there.
Well, of course, the question of authentic is a question that is a perennial sort of, struggle. I mean, what is the authentic voice? I mean, in India, there's a huge debate about whether writing in English can ever be authentic. I mean, if you choose to write in English, can you ever present yourselves as the authentic voice? So it's not a question that will find an easy answer. But I wanted to ask you both one related question, which is, what do you see as the difference in the reception of your writing within the country and outside? If at all that experience has been different or relative? Because of this preconceived idea of what constitutes culture, authentic, place, and person.
I think when I first published my novel, it was 2001, and
This is the
Tutor of History, my first novel. It was, there weren't many English writers. I mean, there have been English writers in Nepal, but there weren't many who had been published internationally, so it was a bit of a delight, I think. And it was, I felt really lucky that, you know, I got a really good reception. And for me, it's always been the case that that I want to, the best Nepali literature is coming out of Nepali languages, and I don't want to write something that isn't at par with that. So that's always been what I've geared towards. And so it was quite a sweet reception. Outside, I think it was just a surprise that there were Nepali writers writing in English. And I honestly feel this, I certainly got that feedback in India that, you know, oh, we didn't know there were Nepalis who wrote in English. So it was, I think, eye-opening.
I meant more in terms of, you know, were there any expectations from you as a woman, as what you say you are, an androgynous person in Nepal, and the kind of writing you were doing, not in terms of English or Nepali?
Well, I think I've made a very conscious decision not, you know, I think the monetary rewards of a certain kind of writing, a more sensationalist writing, are what I've given up, sometimes with great regret.
Could you ever have done it?
You know, it could come in handy someday. But that was a real choice for me,
Okay.
was to stick to the not glamorous stories.
Farah?
I think it was a little different for me in the sense that the column that I write, Food for Thought, for the Star magazine, I've been writing for the better part of 15 years at various kind of frequencies and on a very varied range of topics. And it was actually Facebook that made me realize how many people are apparently reading these columns, because there's a whole younger group of people who have no hesitation about writing you a message on Facebook, telling you what you should have written, what you did right, what they thought was okay, and what they would like you to see doing you know, more of or less of. So I think that by the time it came to fiction, in a way, I got quite a good reception, because there were a group of people who were already interested in what I was writing. And I think I would agree with Manju, because we launched Fragments of River Song at the Hay Festival Dhaka this year. And to be quite honest, I was taken aback by the response. Really, it was absolutely lovely, the number of people who came and did that. Internationally, something similar. I mean, I haven't really experienced it so much in India, but when I was published in the US the first couple of times, I had an editor write to me, and he's of, you know, his parents are South American immigrants to the US, and he considers himself very cosmopolitan. And he said, you know, when we got the first story, they published 2 of my stories in that journal. He said, when we got the first story, I had no idea where Bangladesh was. And I think this is actually quite problematic, because, you know, it's bad enough when it's exotic writing in the sense of unfamiliar, and then if they just don't even know, is that near China or is that near India, you know you're in trouble. And so he said, you know, I read the story, and it was one of the easiest stories, I think, to understand. It's in Fragments of River Song, and it's called Waiting, about 3 very different characters who come together. And that was just interesting to me, because he said, okay, next time I get another submission from Bangladesh, he said, I went off and actually read a bit about Bangladesh after reading the story. So I think that was interesting to see, that, you know, it's not a negative reaction, but there is some surprise, I would say.
So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up. And that is there, I mean, I know that Farah has been part of a group in Bangladesh called Writer's Block, which is where, you know, you share your writing and maybe your hesitations and your insecurities, but also your affirmation. But is there something like that, is there a community with which you engage as well? I mean, sitting in Toronto by yourself in a room?
In Toronto, not so much. I mean, it's a sort of quiet space for me. and I want it to be a quiet space right now until I finish my novel. But in Nepal, I mainly at one point decided that my engagement with Nepali literature would be most helpful to Nepali literature if I translated it into English, and that was also a way for me to educate myself about the various literary movements that Nepal has had. So there's that. It's a very active literary life there. When I was living there a few years ago, it's a very thick community. So you couldn't get away from it if you wanted to. It's quite active.
Right. Now, shall we, is it okay? Would you like to take questions from? So I think we have what, about 7 minutes now? 7 or 8? Okay. So it's open to the floor for anybody who wishes to comment or to question, but it would be nice if it was to the point. I can hardly see actually. Okay, there's a question. Is there a mic there? There's a mic. So could you give it to that lady, please?
Yeah. What I'd like to know is that I have read some literature, feminist literature, but I miss a lot of humor. I don't find humor in feminist literature. Why is that so? Is that our experiences are so grim or something else?
Would you?
Yeah, I think I would suggest that perhaps you've been reading the wrong feminist literature, because to be quite honest, I think in order to survive some of what is handed out, you do indeed have to have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are some amazing cartoonists and I mean, even in different forms of writing. So I think...
and in different languages. Sorry?
Yes, I'll take your
Yes,
email address later and I will
yes.
send you a message with some
We'll
places
send
where
you a
can
list.
chat. Yeah.
There's a question there.
Hi, my question is to Farah. Farah, I want to know that how much is your writing is inspired, or is it at all inspired by the Muslim feminist writers in historical times? For example, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, because I see similarities in the writing, and also I want to know that how much continuity and change can you trace from that time, 18th, 19th century, and to the contemporary era? Thank you.
That's a thesis. So
Yes, I think definitely there is a sense of inspiration. She in particular, actually, because there's also a family connection. Her older sister is my great-great-great-grandmother. Yes. But Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, I didn't actually know that for the longest time. So when I read Sultana's Dream in particular, I was just amazed by the fact that she could at that time be conceptualizing this science fiction world where women were the ones who ran the country and men were the ones who were in parda, you know. And quite apart from that, she's also made these statements along the lines of, you know, if it's women's chastity that you're worried about, then it is men who should be in parda, in fact. So it's interesting. So yes, I would say, when I wrote this story called Judgment Day, which is a sort of futuristic fable about, you know, how the institution of marriage might change in the future as a result of technology. I didn't think of it at the time, but I looked back on it later and I thought, yes, this is there is a degree of continuity. It's a different world and a different imagination, but something along those lines. And in terms of how things have changed in real society, of course, there have been phenomenal changes and very encouraging ones in terms of women's presence in the public sphere. If you look at the garments industry, for all its sins, you know, it has actually made women in Bangladesh a very visible presence on the streets, which it wasn't 20, 30 years ago. Or you look at the work of certain NGOs, and particularly on education and income generation, and things have changed. And there are people who don't want things to change, of course. So, you know, there are conflicting forces there. But I do think that if Begum Ruqayya could see us now, she might not be altogether too sad about how we've turned out in Bangladesh so far.
any others? Okay.
My question is regarding the stereotypical idea of novel as a masculinist form and short story or any other form and something lesser. Even though each and every form has the capability of expressing every emotion as finely as any other forms can. But don't you think when it comes to dealing with issues like feminism or problems with women, novel allows an author the space, scope and span of time to deal with such issues that is needed, which should be reaffirmed time and again, than short story or any other form that novel it gives an author the space and time?
You know, I think that short stories demand compression and demand a sort of concentration of the subject, of the story, of events, of everything has to be very compact. But I think that you can fit a lot into it. And I don't know if you've had this experience of reading a story that after you've finished it just grows and grows in your mind. So I think it's not necessary to have a novel to take on weighty issues. I think short stories can take on very, very weighty issues, but in a compact way is my sense of it.
I mean, I would say that the short story that Farah read out was a quintessentially feminist story which was told in 2 pages. So it doesn't necessarily, and it dealt with all of the issues that you raised. It doesn't necessarily need 200 pages. I mean, of course, it could be written in 200 pages. It would be a different story.
I think when the form that you use basically is about the effect that you want to have. You know, is it a short, sharp shock of one point that you want to put across, which you can do in flash fiction, a slightly more nuanced treatment, which you could do in a short story, but which is essentially still going to focus on 1 or 2 issues within a wider framework. In a novel, you have the time and the luxury to unpack all of it. But I think all of them are, you know, relevant forms depending on what it is that you're trying to say.
Is there, sorry, just a question to the organizers. Is there a book signing facility as
There
well?
is,
Okay,
yes.
you will announce that.
Correct,
Right. Anyway, so can I just wrap it up in a minute? So thank you very much both. It was very nice. I didn't get to ask you my final question, but never mind. No time for that. But I leave it with you, which is, for both of you, not to be answered, which is, what is your single greatest constraint as short story writers?
I have to say that will be continued at the book signing tent, provocatively placed at the end. A big round of applause, please, for... Thank you very much to Farah Ghuznavi, Manjushree, Thapa, and of course Ritu, Menon. Our next session will be carrying straight on after a brief announcement.